let's just begin. We'll start with the Mishnah, and just as an introduction, so as to how the Talmud develops. So you know that we have the written Torah and the oral Torah. We talk about the written Torah and the oral Torah. Well, the written Torah is obviously the Torah and the Bible, Scripture. But it gets a little confusing because the oral Torah is not oral anymore. It's also written. So this is where some of the confusion comes in. The Mishnah is considered to be the oral Torah, meaning the Mishnah develops over time after the Bible and the Torah are developed, and it develops orally. So people are teaching these traditions. Now, some of them are interpretations of Scripture, but it's probably some of them just grow, people live. It's a civilization. So people start to develop rules and for how they should live. These things are taught orally. They're not supposed to be written down. And that's because it's a living culture. And as long as you have a community living near each other, you can have that kind of organic development of your community, of your culture, a legal culture, a religious culture. You can have it because each generation learns from the previous generation. They hold those teachings sacred, and maybe new situations occur, and they use from what they know, and they develop. They have new situations that have to be responded to, and then they pass that teaching on. And Judaism is a very conservative faith, like most religions, and the understanding is that you really didn't deviate from what your teachers taught you. So there's a pretty good direct connection from of hundreds of years where people are just teaching what they learned. But of course, it's, again, as I said, new situations occur, things people have to respond to, and people don't remember exactly how things are what their teacher taught exactly. And we'll see in the Talmud, in this section, in this tractate, that people remember different things from their rabbi. So all of these things are going on, but it's organic and it's developing, which is fine as long as you live in a small community. If you live close to each other, where you can go to a teacher and learn the tradition. But what happens when the Jewish community starts to expand? Some of it is forced by outside forces. Babylonia, we know the Jews are forced to move to Babylonia. Many of them come back after the Babylonians are defeated, but some of them stay in Babylonia. As the Roman Empire takes over in the 1st century before the Common Era, Jews follow the expansion of the empire. And so for all sorts of reasons, opportunities, economic opportunities. And so Jews are living in far-flung places now. And there's an understanding by the religious leadership that you can't just hope to keep this oral tradition going. People live too far away from each other, and traditions will be lost. And so they determine in the beginning of the 3rd century, under the leadership of Rabbi Judah Hanassi, to begin the process of writing it down. Now, actually, they've begun the process of, in a sense, writing it down and organizing these interpretations, these laws, these customs for quite some time. But now they're written down. But what we find is, so what Rabbi Judah Hanassi does is he basically creates an authorized compilation, but it doesn't have everything in it. So what we see, and what we'll see in the Gemara, is there are these texts or these teachings known as a baraita. And a baraita just means outside. It's outside literature, which means it comes from the same period as a Mishnah. It's considered as valuable and meaningful, authoritative in some ways as the Mishnah. It just didn't make it into that final redaction. So the reason for so these baraitas, which are being taught, again, continue to be taught, are known in the community of scholars, many times they'll challenge what the Mishnah says. They say, wait a minute, we have this slightly different teaching. How does that work? And the Talmud is always very concerned with contradiction. They like to resolve everything. They're that personality, Talmud's personality that doesn't like people to disagree. Let's come up with a way that it all makes sense. And so that's what the Gemara will very often do. And we'll see that as well in the Talmud. So the Talmud itself, then, obviously, now you have this written text known as the Mishnah. You have these outside teachings. I don't know enough to know if they were written down as well, or they were just taught orally. Because even the Mishnah, there are sections in the Talmud where in the academy in Babylonia or in the land of Israel, the teacher will say to the Tana is a term for the rabbi at the time of the Mishnah. So, for example, there's Rabbi Eliezer and Yehoshua, who are mentioned in this Mishnah, are Tanaim. That's their name. And the rabbis who are in the Gemara, the period of the Gemara, are known as Amoraim. But a Tana also has a technical term. A Tana is the person who memorized the Mishnah teachings and then spits it out. It's kind of like he's a human Google. So sometimes you'll see in the Gemara where the teacher will say to the Tana, what's the teaching on X? And he'll just spit it out. So some of these may just be oral teachings, these baraitot, may just be oral teachings that are remembered by somebody in the community, or they may even be written down. But in any case, after several generations with this written text now of the Mishnah, these academies are growing. They're growing in Babylonia. They're in the land of Israel. And these conversations and attempts to understand the Mishnah, the source of the Mishnah, where did these rules come from? What propelled the rabbis to teach this law? How does it compare to these outside materials? These discussions develop with other ideas too. Sometimes there's the histories of rabbis, legacies of rabbis that are shared. And this material is collected, the Jerusalem Talmud, which is not really, it's a misnomer. It's not from Jerusalem. I think it's northern, it's like in the Galilee area. But it's also referred to sometimes as the Palestinian Talmud, because that was the name of the land of Israel at that time. Today, a lot of times you'll see it known as the Eretz Yisraeli Talmud, because partially it's a political statement, partially it's also for clarity, because when people hear, oh, the Palestinian Talmud, I didn't know Palestinians were Jews. So I think sometimes it's used, that new term that you hear a lot, the Eretz Yisraeli Talmud, is for clarity's sake. But in any case, those guys, that document was redacted in around the 4th century, so a couple hundred years, 150, 200 years after the Mishnah. And then the Babylonian Talmud, which is usually is the Talmud. That's what we usually study. It was studied more fully over the centuries than the Yerushalmi Talmud, and so it's clearer in some ways, the way it's put together. And it also is that the two Talmuds are different in that they focus on different things. Anyway, the Babylonian Talmud is from is around the 5th, 6th century. It's finally redacted, so it's a little later. But they also focus on different things. Like, for example, the Babylonian Talmud, again, that we usually refer to as the Talmud, has no Talmudic, no Gemara. There's no Gemara on the agricultural laws, except only in the first tractate of the Mishnah is our agricultural laws, except for the first section of the first order, which is Brachot, which does have a Talmud on it. But all the other agricultural sections, the tractates on agriculture, there is no Babylonian Talmud on it, because they were living in Babylonia, and all these laws regarding agriculture deal with the land of Israel. Whereas the Yerushalmi, they do have Talmud on those sections. So there are even some differences, significant differences in what the two Talmuds focus on. But that's what the Talmud is. It's an an advanced, a furthering of the conversation trying to understand the Mishnah. So the Talmud is always going to have, like we have on this page, you're going to have the Mishnah. They're going to start with the Mishnah, and then they're going to pause, and then they're going to go into the Gemara and start talking about the Mishnah. So that's just a basic introduction as to how this is all structured. So let's see, I need different glasses. Okay. So let's start with the Mishnah here. And the Mishnah, this is Taanit, and the tractate of Taanit, for the most part, concerns what are the order of prayers, and how do we observe when there is a drought in the land. And a Taanit is a fast day. And we still have that in our calendar. We have specific fast days. There's Taanit Esther, for example, the day before Purim we fast. And there's a series of, and in the rabbinic world, they would call a Taanit a fast day for all types of reasons. If there was so I thought this was a good one to study. If there's a pandemic, if there's a plague, if there's a lack of rain, if there's a famine, you would call for a Taanit. And then there's a whole structure of what the prayers are. But the Mishnah begins with the discussion of rain, because mostly Taanit, again, a Taanit would be called if there was no rain. And so that's why we're really starting with talking about rain, because we're going to start talking about when do we add this statement in our prayers, Mashiva Ruach Morida Gashem. And that's where we start. And we'll see that there's a reason why they started from this place. So let me just try to read. We'll see if the timing works. I think it's important when we're studying Talmud to hear the actual language, and then go right to the English translation, and we'll follow Steinsaltz's glosses to make sense of what the Mishnah is, what the Mishnah and the Gemara are saying. So it says, gvurot geshamim. From when, what date does one begin to mention the might of the rains? Gvurot geshamim. Mashiv, right? This is the prayer that we say, Mashiv haruach murid hagashem. By inserting the phrase, he makes the wind blow and rain fall in the second blessing of the Amidah prayer. So we have a couple of opinions. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, miyom tov harishon shel chag. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer, miyom tov ha'acharon shel chag. Rabbi Eliezer says you insert this phrase from the first festival day of the festival of Sukkot. And I mentioned in the notes that he adds here of Sukkot, because in rabbinic Hebrew, there are certain names for festivals. And Chag, literally the holiday, is Sukkot. So the first day of Sukkot. Rabbi Yoshua says from the last day of the festival of Sukkot. So basically a week apart. Okay, what's the reason for the difference? Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, ho'il ve'ein agshamim ela siman klala bechag. Lama hu maskir. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Af ani lo amarti lish'ol ela lazkir mashiva ruach umorida gashem bi'onato. Amar lo im kein leo lam yehe maskir. So this introduces us to basically the issue of what are we talking about when we say might of the rains? Are we talking about mentioning God's power to bring rain? Because that's what we say in the second blessing. We had that Mashiva Ruach Morida Gashem is in the second blessing of the Amidah, which talks about God's powerfulness. God's so powerful, God heals the sick, God frees the captive, God brings life to the dead. That's Tchiata Meitim. And God brings rain. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is asking God for rain. And that's where some of the confusion is going to be. So Rabbi Yeshua says to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, who says you should mention rain on the last day of the Sukkot, he says, since rain is nothing other than a sign of a curse during the festival of Sukkot, because rainfall forces Jews to leave their Sukkot, why should one mention the might of rain during this period? We don't, if it's raining outside during Sukkot, you don't have to eat your meal in the sukkah. In fact, you're not supposed to eat your meal in the sukkah. So why would you want to ask God for rain during that? If God responds to your request, your Sukkot is ruined. Your sukkah holiday is ruined. So Rabbi Eliezer said to him, I too did not say that it's proper to request rain at this time, but it is proper only to mention the phrase. He makes the wind blow and rain fall in its due time. Rabbi Yoshua said to him, but if that's your reasoning, if reciting the phrase does not constitute a request for rain, then you should always mention rain, even in the summer, right? It's pretty impressive. God may bring rain at any time, right? Isn't that so? So the response of the Mishnah is no. One requests rain only immediately preceding the rainy season. I should have said, Ein shoalin at the gishamim ela samuch l'gishamim. You only ask for rain right before it's the rainy season. In Israel, there's 2 rainy seasons. They don't have, basically in that part of the world, there's not 4 seasons like we have. There's 2 seasons. There's the rainy season and the dry season. And the rainy season is wintertime. So the Rabbi Eliezer seems to be saying is you should talk about God's power to bring rain at the time when rain would normally fall. You don't talk about God's power to bring rain in the summer when it's not going to come. Rabbi Yeshua seems to be focusing on, well, you should, you can make that statement. It's a general statement about God's power. You can do that anytime, but you should only ask for rain. And you should only mention God's power for rain and ask for rain when you want it. Rabbi Eliezer seems to be saying, no, you ask for rain when it's proper, but the season for rain actually begins around Sukkot. So it's okay to mention God's power for rain, to bring rain at that time. But you don't ask God specifically in a prayer until you want the rain. Okay, so that's their disagreement. Now we have Rabbi Yehuda says, let me get this here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ha'over lifnei hateva b'yom tov ha'acharon shel chag, ha'acharon mazkir, harishon eino mazkir, b'yom tov rishon shel Pesach, harishon mazkir, ha'acharon eino mazkir. This is slightly different. Now we're talking about liturgy. And Rabbi Yehuda brings up that when the, with regard to one who passes before the ark, that means you're the prayer leader on the concluding day of the festival. Now we're going back to Rabbi Yoshua's opinion. The prayer leader, we're talking about Shmini Atzeret. That's the last day. That's the last festival day of the festival of Sukkot, right? So Sukkot is 7 days. Shmini Atzeret is a separate holiday unto itself, but it comes right after the 7-day festival of Sukkot. And so Rabbi Yehuda is saying that on that last day of festival, Shmini Atzeret, the first prayer leader, the one who's leading Shacharit, the last prayer leader who leads the additional prayer mentions rain. Yeah, the first prayer leader, the morning service, the Shacharit service, does not mention rain. It's only in Musaf on Shmini Atzeret, which is what our custom is today. Pesach time, when we stop mentioning rain and asking for rain, it's the opposite. On that day, on the first day of Pesach, we stop asking for rain. We stop mentioning Mashiva Ruach U'Morida Gashem. The first prayer leader says it, but it's the Musaf person who stops saying it. So on the first day of Pesach, that's when we have the special poem called Tfilat Tal, where we no longer say Mashiva Ruach, but we begin to say, well, at least in Israel, they say Morid Hatal, who brings dew. In the Ashkenazic liturgy, in the diaspora, we just don't say anything. We stop saying Mashiva Ruach U'Morida Gashem. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. And now the Gemara is going to start asking some questions. And the first question the Gemara asks is, Tana hecha ka'e dekatane me'ematai, Tana hatam kai. So the Gemara asks, where does the Tana of the Mishnah stand, literally? That is, where's he coming from? That he's going to teach from when do we say, right up here it was from when do we begin to mention the might of rains? Because the Gemara is saying, this is Taanit. Why are we talking about when to mention rain and stop mentioning rain? Where's we're in Taanit. Shouldn't we be talking about, go right into talking about fast days and what we do? So they want to know, so why are we starting here? And the answer is the Tana, again, that Mishnaic rabbi, or the Mishnaic teaching, is standing there. And there, of course, they don't mention it, but we're going to learn from the text. He bases himself on a Mishnah in Brachot. Now, Brachot, again, is the first Mishnah. There are 6 orders of the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah is broken up. It's a huge text. It's broken up into 6 sections called orders. Each order then is broken up into smaller pieces. The first order of the Mishnah is agricultural law, but the very first tractate in that agricultural law is Brachot, which is about blessings. The second section of the Mishnah is festivals. So we'll get to that in a moment. Let's see, where do we go here? Okay. Dikatane, as it's taught in this Mishnah in Brachot, Mazkirin gvurot geshamim betchiyat hamet, v'sholim b'virkat hashanim, v'avdala betoch hada'at, v'katane be'ematai mazkirin gvurot geshamim. Okay. So in the Brachot, in this, on page 33a in the Gemara, but it's in a Mishnah, it says, it states, one mentions the might of rains, gvurot geshamim, and recites, he makes the wind blow and the rain fall in the second blessing of the Amidah prayer, the blessing of Techiyat HaMeitim. We usually refer to the second blessing as Gvurot because it's all about God's power, but the rabbis usually refer to it as Techiyat HaMeitim, resurrection of the dead, because that was the greatest example of God's power. God brings the dead back to life. So you put it in that, so you mention God's power, ability to bring rain in that blessing, but the request for rain, where we ask God to give us rain as a blessing, that is in the 9th blessing of the Amidah, the blessing of years. I don't have it in front of me, but that's
alert from messages. Brianne McMahon.
That's the blessing where we ask God for a good year of agricultural blessing, that the things should grow. So we ask God for rain in that section. And then it goes on to say in this section, it also talks about the Havdalah blessing that we mention in the 4th blessing of the Amidah, who grants knowledge. So if you, on Saturday night, in that very first request that we make, after the first 3 blessings, after of the Amidah, which are statements, and then we ask God for knowledge, that's where we put the Havdalah section in the Amidah. And okay, and it's so and it is based on that Mishnah, which establishes the obligation to request rain, that this Mishnah teaches from when does one begin to mention the might of rains. Okay, so that's where they got it from. They were in the very beginning of the Talmud, the very opening section of Mishnah. They mentioned they have this whole thing about rain, about when you put rain, the request for rain, and the mention of God's power to bring rain in Brachot. Okay, so then the Gemara asks a logical question: Velit nehatam. Well, so let the Tana teach the halacha there. Why did we have to bring it into Taanit? What's different about this case that he left it until here? Why did he put it here? And the response is simply, Ella, Tana merosh Hashanah salek ditnan uvechag nidonim al hamayim. So in the second section of the Mishnah on festivals, directly before the tractate Taanit is the tractate Rosh Hashanah. And in the tractate of Rosh Hashanah, at the very beginning, it says there are 4 times a year when the world is judged. And the world is judged at Sukkot for rain. So the explanation is that in Rosh Hashanah they also started to talk about rain, and since they mentioned judging the world by rain, then they go on to talk about a bunch of other things in Rosh Hashanah. Then they came back to this discussion. And on the festival of Sukkot, all creatures are judged for water. That's in Rosh Hashanah. Since the Taanit taught, and on the festival of Sukkot, all creatures are judged for water, from which it can be inferred that one should request rain near the time of this judgment, he brought it up here as we started to talk about when you don't have rain. So from when does the mention of the might of the rains? So again, here we just have this discussion of the Gemara is trying to understand why this section Taanit begins with this whole discussion of when we add to our liturgy Mashiva Ruach Morid Gashem, and when we add requests for rains. So that's one of the things that the Gemara will do. They just want to try to understand, why does it set up this way? Why is the structure set up this way? Now we get to a new question. The Gemara asks a question with regard to the language of the Mishnah. So now we're curious about language. Velit nemei matai mazkirin al geshami. My gvurot geshamim. Why then did it talk about gvurot geshamim, the power of rain, the might of rains? Rabbi Yochanan said, because rains fall with might. Okay, and let's see, where's the little background here? You can see this here. Some of this background information is always very helpful. The issue of rainfall is discussed at great length in Taanit. The Gemara explains that the might of God is manifested particularly through rain, both due to its power and because of the controlled way in which it falls, as strength and control are both characteristics of might. Nowadays, the force of rainfall can be measured. It is estimated that the energy released in any large rainstorm exceeds that of an atomic bomb. Okay, that's pretty powerful. All right. So we go back to this. So that's the... and now you're going to see how they're going to use scripture to offer proof of this statement, of why they're using the phrase gvurot rain, why it's appropriate. When talking about God's power to bring rain, we refer gvurot hagshamim. So Rabbi Yochanan said, and Rabbi Yochanan is one of the early Amoraim. He's the first generation of Talmudic rabbis. He lives in the land of Israel. You can always tell the difference between a Babylonian and a Palestinian Talmudic rabbi, because Rabbi is Palestinian, Rav is Babylonian. So this is Rabbi Yochanan. He lives in the land of Eretz Israel. He says, because the rains fall with might. Okay, the might of the rain displays God's power in the world, as it is stated, and he brings two proof texts from Job, who does great things beyond comprehension. And the verse is, Osei gidolot, gidolah, and gvura are synonyms. Ad ein cheker, v'niflaot ad ein mispar. And it's also written in Job. We have a verse that says, Hanotein matar, matar is another word for rain, al panei haaretz, v'sholeach mayim al panei chutzot. So that who does great things beyond comprehension, marvels without number, it's also who gives rain upon the earth, sends water upon the fields. Now, the problem with this is these are two verses in Job, same book, but they, one is talking about God does great things, and the other one talks about God giving rain. So are they this? How do we connect those two? So the Gemara asks, from where may it be inferred that these verses indicate that rainfall is considered a mighty act, right? And this verse up here didn't say that rain was mighty. It just said God gives rain upon the earth. So another Talmudic rabbi offers a solution. Rabba Bar Shela said, it's derived by means of a verbal analogy. The term comprehension, cheker, and the term comprehension, cheker, in another verse from a passage that deals with the creation of the world. And here's that verse. That was from Job. And this one's from Isaiah. Halo yadata im lo shamata Elohei olam Adonai borei kitzot haaretz lo ya'af lo yiga ein cheker litvunato. Okay, so this verse says, have you not known, have you not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not grow faint or weary? His discernment is beyond comprehension. So here, God is creator, and here you with the word cheker shows up in this verse, and this verse does great things, and you got cheker. So you got great things, you got creator connected by this word comprehension, cheker. This shows that both creation and rainfall are beyond comprehension. And concerning the creation of the world, as is written elsewhere, and this comes from Psalms, Mechin harim b'kocho nezar b'gvura, sets firm the mountains with your strength, who is girded with might. From this verse, it can be inferred that rainfall, like the creation of the world, reflects God's might. All right, so you have a bunch of these verses that if you put them all together, you've got creator, you've got God beyond comprehension, strength, power. And so that's where you get this idea of gvurot geshamim, power of rains, that it's a powerful act that God does. And here, let's get to the end of this section. Umanalan b'tfilah. From where do we derive that rain must be mentioned specifically in the and again, language, Talmudic language, tefillah means prayer, but usually in rabbinic Hebrew, tefillah means the Amidah. You know, it's like the prayer, the big prayer, the quintessential prayer. So that's what. So it's asking. Where in the Amidah, or from where do we learn that we should mention rain in the Amidah? The Tanya, and that's a code word in the Gemara. Tanya is from a Baraita. One of these sources didn't make it in the Mishnah, but it's understood in the oral traditions. Le'ahava et Adonai Elohechem ulavdo b'chol levavchem. That's from the paragraph of the Shema. Ezo hi avodah shehi belev have omer zot tefillah. So here's the explanation. Where do we learn that we should be talking about rain in the Amidah? The Gemara answers, as it was taught in a Baraita with regard to the verse, to love the Lord your God and to avoid God with all your heart. To serve God with all your heart. Well, what is serving God with your heart? Oh, that's prayer. Again, what is prayer? Prayer is tefillah. Prayer is the Amidah. And I shall give the rain of your land. It's in that same, it's the very next verse. The time, the rain, and the last rain. The juxtaposition teaches that it is appropriate to request rain while engaged in the service of the heart, prayer. So again, you have this rabbinic thinking. In chapter 11 of Deuteronomy, which we have in the second paragraph of the Shema, you have two verses in a row. One is to love God and to serve God with all your heart, which means prayer. The next verse says, God talks about giving rain. The first rain and the last rain, we'll get to that in a little later. First rains and last rains when it's appropriate. So there's a connection there. There's a connection between prayer and God giving us rain. We should pray. Part of our prayer should be for rain.
So
far?
When was the Amidah fairly firmly set?
That's a really good question.
Because I wondered that when I read this.
So I'm not sure when it was completely set. Certainly the Talmud talks about it. The Mishnah refers to it. So certainly by the 2nd century of the Common Era, they had some kind of an Amidah. It's not clear if it's the exact same Amidah as we have. The Talmud has a whole discussion of one of the other names for the Amidah is the Shemona Esrei, which is 18. But in our version that we've been saying for 1,000 years, there's 19. And the Talmud has an explanation for that, that there was a time that they needed to add a 19th blessing. So obviously there were different, and then we have Geniza fragments, which have different versions of the Amidah, very close to what we have today, but they're just different, where there are 18. So even into the Middle Ages, there were some communities that had only 18. So it's not clear what, when it was developed, probably sometime in the 1st, 2nd century. There may have been a proto Amidah. We know from the Mishnah in the Temple period, some of the prayers that we recite in the Amidah, like the prayer for peace, was recited in temple liturgy, according to the Mishnah. So some of it may have been even as far back as the period of the Second Temple, but probably after the destruction of the temple is when they began to actually create what we call the Amidah today.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go to the next section. Okay, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Shlosha maftechot biyado shel hakadosh baruch hu shelo nimseru biyad shaliach ve'eluhein mifatech shel geshamim mifatech shel chaya mifatech shel tchiyat hametim. This is really beautiful. This is why I love Taanit too, because we had a lot of nice midrashic teachings. The Gemara now cites again, and this is kind of the stream of consciousness of the Talmud. So we were just talking about prayer, asking God for rain in our prayers. And now Rabbi Yochanan teaches that there are, or his teaching is placed into the Gemara, that there are 3 keys. A key is, the word for key is mafteach. So there are like 3 openings. Poteach means to open. A mafteach is a key, which obviously opens doors. So let's see, they say 3 keys. Okay, so the comment here is the 3 keys all refer to significant changes to reality. Rainfall and childbirth appear to be natural events. They are considered by the Gemara to be departures from the normal course of nature, no less than the resurrection of the dead. So here are the 3 keys, and it's that I love the key of rain. Oh, and what the essence here is, God does it directly. It's not, there's no gershom. There's no, let's see, what do we have for a note on the intermediaries? Rabbeinu Gershom and Rashi and their commentaries maintain that this means only that the 3 keys cannot be transmitted to a single intermediary at the same time. This opinion is based on a midrash that Elijah was given 2 of the 3 keys, but not all 3. Okay, but the idea is that these are things that come directly from God. And what comes directly from God? There's no angels who do this. It's birthing. It's rain. Where is it up here? Oh, here it is. Rain, birthing, and resurrection of the dead. Rabbi Yochanan cites verses to support this claim. Here again, we have going to scripture to support your teaching. The key of rain, as it is stated, the Lord will open for you his good treasure, the heavens, to give you the rain of your land in its due time. It's from Deuteronomy. Indicates that rainfall is controlled by God himself. Where is it derived? The key of birthing is maintained by God. As it is written, and God remembered Rachel and listened to her, and he opened her womb. Okay, there you go. God opened her womb. Obviously, God is the one who makes these decisions. I thought it was the doctor who induced Tali, but it was actually God who made that decision. And from where is it derived that the key of the resurrection of the dead is maintained by God himself? And here from a passage from Ezekiel, you shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves. That's from the Valley of Dry Bones. And here's another one. Okay, and here's a further teaching on this same topic. B'ma'arva amri af mafteach shel parnasah. In the west, right? This is Eretz Yisrael because Babylonia is east. So whenever they say in the west, they're talking about the Jews in the land of Israel, which has a different opinion than the Jews of Babylonia. They say the key of livelihood is also in God's hand. As it is written, you open your hand and satisfy every living thing with favor. That's from the Ashrei. The Gemara asks, and what's the reason that Rabbi Yochanan did not consider this key of livelihood in his list, right? He only had 3. So why didn't he add this? And he's also in Eretz Yisrael. Why didn't he add livelihood? The Gemara answers that Rabbi Yochanan could have said to you, rain is the same as livelihood in this regard, as rain is indispensable to all livelihoods. And I'll just point out that where do we place the request for rain in the Amidah? In the blessing where we ask God to provide a positive livelihood. Okay, so now going to the next section. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Miyom Tov Rishon Shel Chag. We're going back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah taught that Rabbi Eliezer says one mentions rain from the first festival day of the festival of Sukkot, and a dilemma was raised before the sages. From where did Rabbi Eliezer derive this halacha? He must have learned it from one of two mitzvot of Sukkot that are linked to rain. Did he derive it from the mitzvah to wave luvlav, or did he derive it from the obligation of the water libation? So here the Gemara is interested again. Where did Rabbi Eliezer come up with this rule? He must have gotten it from somewhere, from some interpretation. So so did he learn it from the mitzvah of lulav and etrog, right? That's mitzvah of Sukkot, which connected to rain, right? That's why we're binding those four species and walking around calling out Hoshana. We need the rain. God, here, we need the rain. Here's an idea. We're bringing our plants together, so you'll get the idea. Or did he derive it from the obligation of the water libation? And I suggested in the notes that you read about the water libation because this was a special celebration during the festival of Sukkot. In addition to the other special offerings brought in the temple, a water libation was poured. This libation is not mentioned explicitly in the Torah, its source being an oral tradition transmitted to Moses from Sinai. The water libation was accompanied by great festivity and ceremony. The water was drawn from the Siloam pool and poured into a basin placed upon a hole in the southwestern corner of the altar. According to tradition, this hole and the adjacent hole where wine was poured descended to the depths of the world. The water libation was offered all 7 days of Sukkot, even on Shabbat, even though it was not permitted to draw water for it on Shabbat. So you have this ceremony, this celebration of water, expressing gratitude to God for water. And notice that it's an oral tradition. There's nowhere in the Torah that talks about this, but an oral tradition, usually when it says transmitted to Moses from Mount Sinai, it means it's a really ancient tradition. They don't know where it comes from. They can't figure out the source. So you have two possibilities. So where did Rabbi Eliezer get this idea of mentioning rain from the first day of Sukkot? Was it lulav or was it the water libation? So the Gemara clarifies the significance of this dilemma. They derive this halacha from the lulav, in which case one would say, just as the mitzvah to take the lulav applies during the day and not at night, so too the mention of rain begins during the day of the first festival of Sukkot. Or perhaps he derives it from the water libation, in which case one would say, just as the water libation can be prepared from the first night, you don't do it at nighttime, you do it during daytime, but you prepare the water at night, as the master said with regard to this verse, and their meal offerings and their libations, and certain meal offerings and libations may be brought even at night too, so the mention of rain begins from the evening. So there is a significance, and not just a question of, hey, where do we get this idea? Is it from lulav? Is it from water libation? There are consequences to the distinction. If you say he got it from lulav, then you only say it, you start asking for rain in the morning service. If you say water libation, since you can start preparing that in the evening, you start asking for rain or mentioning rain even in the evening. Okay, now we have the Gemara wants to resolve this. Tashma, the Amar Rabbi Abahu lo lemada Rabbi Eliezer ela milulav. Ika da amri Rabbi Abahu Gemara Gamirla ve'ika da amri Matnita Shamile. Okay, first of all, Tashma is often common here, a resolution, which is really interesting because again, this is oral Torah. So obviously this was a reference to the times when they would teach orally. So Rabbi Abahu said, this is again a Talmudic rabbi, said that Rabbi Eliezer derived the halacha from nothing other than the case of lulav. He says it's lulav, not water libation. There's another tradition that has it though. Some say Rabbi Abahu learned this claim of Rabbi Eliezer, that his derivation of this law, by way of a tradition, which was the source of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And some say he learned it from a baraita. So another opinion says that there's two possibilities from where he learned it. He may have learned, according to Rabbi Abahu, Rabbi Eliezer may have learned it from tradition. That's that ancient halakha of that we don't really know the source. Or he might have learned it from a textual source, a baraita. Let's go down a little farther here. Okay, so they say, Mahi, what baraita? Mahi detanya me'imatay mazkirin al hageshamim, Rabbi Eliezer Omer misha'at nitilat lulav, Rabbi Yoshua Omer misha'at hanachato. Okay, so what baraita? If he learned it from this authoritative teaching, which one was it? Well, the Gemara answer is we have a baraita. It's not in the Mishnah, but a teaching from that period that somebody remembers, and now we've written it down. It's not in the Mishnah, but it is from one of these authoritative texts. From when does one begin to mention the rains in his prayers? It's a little bit different from what we read earlier. Here, a little more descriptive. Rabbi Eliezer says from the time that one takes the lulav, that is the first day of Sukkot. Rabbi Yoshua says from the time one puts down the lulav at the conclusion of Sukkot. So before we had Rabbi Eliezer saying in the Mishnah, it said first day of Sukkot. Rabbi Yehoshua says it's the last day of the festival. Well, now we get a little coloration in here. It's not just from the first time. According to this other source, it's the day you take up the lulav, which happens to be the first day of Sukkot. Rabbi Yehoshua says when you put down the lulav, which of course the last day of Sukkot. All right, new set. We're going to keep going on with this. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, hoil ve'arba minim halalu einan ba'in ela l'ratzot al hamayim ukshem she'arba minim halalu efshar behem below mayim kach efshar le'olam below mayim. The Baraita discusses cites a discussion of these opinions. Rabbi Eliezer said, it is since these four species, the lulav and the other three species, come only to offer appeasement for water as they symbolize the rainfall of the coming year. And this symbolism is as follows. Just as these four species cannot exist without water, they need water to grow, so too the world cannot exist without water. Therefore, it is proper to mention rain in one's prayers when taking the four species. There's the connection. The world needs water, these four species need water, and so we begin asking for rain, not just for Sukkot, but we begin asking for rain at this time of Sukkot, the time when rain's supposed to fall to benefit the whole world, but obviously directly it benefits the growing of these species. Now, Rabbi Yoshua then answered a response. But rain during the festival Sukkot is nothing other than a sign of curse, right? That was in the Mishnah, but it's also in this Baraita.
Yeah, that can, I don't know about that statement. When you first read it way back at the beginning, I was like, well, who's he to say it's the sign of a curse? I mean, maybe not. He just sort of came up with it, ex nihilo.
Yeah. Well, no, remember, but the reason why he said it was a curse is because you're not allowed to dwell in your sukkah if it's raining.
Well, yeah. I mean, if it's raining a lot, what if it's drizzling or misting?
Right, okay. But the idea is that and the reason why it's a curse is because according to a midrash, God is angry with the people and doesn't want them to fulfill the mitzvah of the sukkah
Oh.
So that's how he's deriving it.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
So Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yeshua, I too did not say that it's proper to ask for rain at this time, but only to mention it. And just as with regard to the resurrection of the dead, one mentions it the entire year, and yet it will only come at its proper time when God wills the resurrection. So too, one mentions the might of rains all year. You could if you wanted to, and they fall only in but even though they only fall in their season. Therefore, if one seeks to mention rain throughout the year, he may mention it here. He could, but you don't have to. and we don't. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, this is the person who put the Mishnah together, says, I say that when one ceases to request rain, one also ceases to mention it. Okay, so a couple things here. The again, Rabbi Eliezer is also now connecting resurrection of the dead with rain, which is again what we see in that second blessing. The blessing that talks about God resurrecting the dead is also the blessing in which we mention God's power to bring rain. Because in a sense, rain also brings resurrection, right? I mean, we know that things can't grow without the rain. So that's why he says, so he's again distinguishing asking for rain and mentioning God's power to bring rain. And then we have the statement from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Oh, okay, let me just tell Elon is calling me. Okay, I'll just. Where was I? There. So Rabbi Yehuda Anasi just mentions, this is a separate teaching, that when you stop asking for rain, you also stop mentioning it, which is again what we do. So in even in the land of Israel, mentioning God's power to bring rain and asking for the rain to begin come at different times. Certainly that's in the diaspora. We have a couple months go by before we start asking God for rain. And we'll get to that. But let's go back to, so you have this connection that Eliezer, this analogy, just as God, just as we can ask, we hope anytime we ask God for the resurrection of the dead all year long, so too you can ask for rain all year long. You can mention God's power to bring rain all year long, but you only ask for it when you need it, when it's appropriate to ask. Now we have Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. This is a rabbi from the Talmudic period. He says on the second day of the festival of Sukkot, you begin to mention rain rather than on the first day. Now, Rabbi Akiva has a different opinion. On the sixth day, you mention rain. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Yoshua, it's a little confusing here. Is this the same guy? It's not, but we're going to be, this is what the Gemara is going to be focused on. With regard to the one who passes before the ark as prayer leader on the concluding day of the festival of Sukkot, the 8th day of assembly, the last prayer leader of the additional prayer mentions rain, whereas the first prayer leader, the Shacharit leader, does not mention it. And then same thing we learned in the Mishnah. Conversely, on the first festival day of Pesach, the first prayer leader mentions rain, the Musaf leader does not. The Gemara asks, Rabbi Eliezer is speaking well to Rabbi Yoshua. How does Rabbi Yoshua respond to Rabbi Eliezer's powerful argument that one can mention God's praises at any time of the year? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Yoshua could have said to you, granted with regard to the resurrection of the dead, one mentions this daily, as although it is not fulfilled every day, any day could be its proper time, right? Any day the Mashiach could come, right? We were hoping it could show up any time, but however, in the case of rain, all times when it falls in its proper time. You don't necessarily want rain at all the time during the year. Didn't we learn in a Mishnah, if the month of Nisan has ended, right? This is Pesach time, and rains begin to fall, that's the sign of a curse. No, so this is a little bit different than what we heard before. So what's the curse? The curse of rain is if it falls in like the spring. As it is said, is not the wheat harvest today. This is from the book of Samuel. Samuel is very angry. The people wanted a king, and he's very irritated with them. And he says, I'll show you that God's not happy. I will call to the Lord that he may send thunder and rain, and you will know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking for a king. So there are times when it's not good, because you don't want it to rain during the wheat harvest. It ruins the harvest. So there are times when rain can be a curse, at least in the land of Israel, where you have these very specific seasonal periods. So that's his response is, yeah, you don't want rain whenever. You can't use the argument that resurrection of the dead is similar to rain, because today would be a great day. Spring, summer, fall, winter, great day when the Mashiach shows up. We just want that to happen anytime. But rain, you don't want to come except when you need it. So that analogy, Rabbi Eliezer, doesn't really hold. Okay, now we get back to these two other opinions of Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera and Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, he's a Mishnaic rabbi, okay, or a period of that time. On the second day of the festival of Sukkot, one begins to mention rain. So not the first day, he says the second day. Why? So what's the reason for this ruling? The Gemara answers, as it's taught, a baraita that deals with the source for water libation on Sukkot, that Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, the Torah alludes to the water libation in its description of the libations of the additional offerings of Sukkot. The Torah uses a slightly different term for the libations of certain days. On most days, it states that the sin offering must be brought with its libation, v'niska, in the singular form. And this is true. If you looked up in Numbers, where we go through all the daily offerings during Sukkot, it's almost the exact same wording, except for 3 times. There are 3 slightly different terms in the passages. And they're just off by like 1 letter. So he's going to tell us that's an illusion. That's teaching us something. By contrast, it is stated on the second day that one must offer their libations, v'niske hem, got a little mem there at the end, an additional mem. The plural form indicates the presence of multiple offerings. And furthermore, it is stated concerning the sin offering libations on the 6th day, unisacheha, there's an additional yud, which is again plural form about many libations. And finally, it is stated with regard to the libations of the additional offering on the 7th day, that it must apportion the respective animals according to their laws, kimishpatam. And all the other times it's mishpati, kimishpat, but in this passage, on the 7th day, it's got mishpatam, so that's an additional mem. So you've got these 3 letters. And these variations yield the 3 superfluous letters, mem, yud, mem. V'niskehem, unisacheha, kamishpatam, and mem, yud, mem spells, oh my goodness, spells mime. The letter yud is, so those 3 words, if you can take out those extra letters, they spell mime. From here, you learn an allusion to the mitzvah of the water libation, water, mime. Okay, so why do you start on the second day? And what is different about the second day that Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera took it, we're almost done here, took it as the day on which one begins to mention rain? The Gemara answers the reason is that when the verse first alludes to the water libation, that was day number 2 with that extra letter, multiple libations, one of them must be water, not wine. It's on the second day that it alludes to it. Therefore, we start mentioning it on the second day because it's a little clue. Okay. Well, Rabbi Akiva has a different opinion. And this one I was a little confused with, but okay. The Baraita states, Rabbi Akiva says, on the 6th day, Bashishi bechag hu mazkir, shene'amar bashishi unisacheha. The Gemara explains that this ruling is based on the allusion to the water libation in the offering of this day, as it is stated on the 6th day, and its libations. The allusion is written in plural, which indicates the verse is speaking of the 2 libations. One is the water libation, and the other is the standard wine libation. Now, it seemed to me that that's exactly what Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera was saying. So I don't know why he chooses the 6th day. That was a little confusing to me. But in any case, he follows, well, here it explains. The Gemara raises an objection, even if it's accepted that the verse is referring to 2 libations, one could say that both libations are of wine. How do you know that one of them is water? Well, because Rabbi Akiva holds to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera's view that you those 3 extra letters in the offerings allude to water, mem, yud, mem, mayim. It's just unlike Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, he argues the phrase unisachecha, or unsachecha, that's the day that you start mentioning it. So he just interprets it differently, but he likes the mayim part. He just disagrees that it's not day 2, it's day number 6. And I think this is okay, so this is the very end of what we've come up for this week. The Gemara objects, if Rabbi Akiva holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera with regard to this derivation, let him say that it is in accordance with his ruling that one begins mentioning it from the 2nd day of Sukkot, not the 6th day. Right? He should hold just like Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. He's agreeing with him. Rabbi Akiva, though, holds differently because when the extra reference to the libation is written in the verse, right, that extra yud, which is in plural form, it is with regard to the 6th day that it is written. In other words, it is the plural phrase, its libations, which appear on the 6th day, that directly indicates that one must perform more than one libation, while the other 2 superfluous letters merely serve to teach that this second libation must be of water, not wine. Therefore, this additional libation is performed on the 6th day. The main point, though, is that Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera and Rabbi Akiva disagree with the earlier opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that the water, that we start asking or mentioning, we start mentioning rain on day 1 because they have their own interpretation of, based on this section from Numbers, in which they're reading something into the Torah text itself. So, and in a sense, this is, you might say, more weight because they're finding clues in the Torah verses themselves for when to begin reciting this this addition to the second blessing, the Mashiva Ruach Umrida Gashem. Rabbi Eliezer, we saw, had it connected conceptually to lulav and etrog, or possibly the water libation experience. But in both cases, so it's kind of 2 different ways of reading Torah and reading tradition, and deriving some of these rules. As for the halacha, we follow Rabbi Yoshua, who said we start mentioning the rain at Shmini Atzeret, and we'll learn as we go through these opening dapim of Taanit that even in the land of Israel, we start asking for rain a little bit later than Shmini Atzeret. So even in the land of Israel, there's a distinction. In the diaspora, we know that it's actually not even based on the Hebrew calendar. This is the question that comes up every year. Why does it say in the prayer book, we start reciting rain in the diaspora? We start asking for rain in the diaspora in that 9th blessing on December 4th. What does December 4th have to do with Jewish calendar? Well, we'll see that it actually has to do with the autumnal equinox. And then there's a change because of from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar that also impacted on when we start saying it. But it has to do with the seasons of the year and certain amount of days after the equinox, which was understood to be the time that rain falls in Babylonia. So we follow that tradition, even though in the United States, that's not really when rain starts to fall. It falls all the time. But anyway, but we have this distinction. The main point here in this beginning is distinction between mentioning God's power to bring rain and requesting God to bring rain. We request it when it makes sense, but we can mention it even at an earlier period of time. Okay, so that's our beginning. I'll start sending out the notes for page number 3, daf number 3 tomorrow, and we'll keep going. If you have questions, I mean, now it's already past 12 o'clock, but if you have questions during the week, don't be afraid to email me as you're going through the material, and I'll answer during the week. But we can also, don't be afraid to ask questions on this morning class either. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. hope everyone enjoyed that, and we'll see you on next. Well, hopefully before then, but certainly next Sunday at 11.
Sounds
All right,
good.
take
Have a
care.
great day.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.